This is The Healing Time by Persha Gertler. Finally, on my way to yes, I bump into all the places where I said no to my life. All the unintended wounds, the red and purple scars, those hieroglyphs of pain carved into my skin and bones, those coded messages that send me down the wrong street again and again, where I find them. The old wounds, the misdirections, and I lift them one by one close to my heart and say, holy, holy. In midlife, we often face a turning point where we are called to something larger in our life, begging us to change. This is my personal journey. Most of it set about 20 years ago in Denver, and here's where I'll begin. I was the youngest of 8 children in a very large, devout Catholic family, so I had strong spiritual influences. With a large gap between me and my next brother in age, I was an only child during my adolescence when my dad was recovering from alcoholism. Mom and I both participated in Al-Anon 12-step group as part of that recovery. Living on a ranch at the time here in Colorado, there was plenty of time for me to have solo time outside. And my sister Roseanne, about that same time, was beginning life as a Benedictine nun in Nebraska. With all these influences, I was broadening my own spiritual life and was relatively at ease with being somewhat of a contemplative. Around age 19, I stopped attending Catholic services because it all seemed too stuffy. And I had what one can only call a spiritual vision. There were no drugs involved, and I'll save the details for later. But basically, this vision showed me that I could have a direct experience with the divine, with spirit, ultimate reality, whatever you want to call it, without needing an intermediary, aka a priest. Key to it all was an inner guiding voice that led me to this discovery. 3 years later, my father began a horrific 2-year journey with esophageal cancer that ultimately took his life. I was wanting to escape from the pain. And about that same time, I met my first husband, whom I shall call Joe. My early years with Joe were filled with hedonic pleasures of crazy music, wild art, deli foods, intellectual mind candy, and getting high. I recognized that Joe had a daily dependence on alcohol, but I married him anyway. Eventually, feeling the need for something more meaningful in my life, I returned to various self-help and inner child work and relearned the value of the AA wisdom, feel, deal, heal. I began to recognize how my former husband, in his own way, was emotionally unavailable. My dad had been emotionally unavailable in my childhood, falling asleep in his chair night after night. Meanwhile, I began seeking more social support for my ongoing journey of self-discovery and found my way to various eco-spiritual and activist groups. For several years, the Earth Literacy Companions met once a month for a wholesome potluck and 4 hours of discussion afterward, deepening our connection to nature. Ultimately, we hosted a 10-day immersion in Earth Literacy with Sister Miriam McGillis. She's a primary teacher of Thomas Berry's work and the New Cosmology, learning the scientific origin story of our Earth and the universe within a spiritual context. This work filled me with resonance, and it shifted my worldview. Miriam even said that she had seen this work change marriages, and she was so right. I was becoming a different person, and as I changed, the dynamics of the relationship changed. 10 years into this marriage, drug testing became part of Joe's job, and without marijuana to temper the beer, the dependence on alcohol accelerated. A friend and I convinced Joe that his drinking was definitely a problem for us. Pressured to do so, he did give up the alcohol, and life got better for a while, but ultimately he entered a dry drunk phase because he never did the inner work that's part of that program. Joe began criticizing me, suppressing all of what I valued, especially my eco-spiritual life. This eroded my self-esteem. When I had things to say that were being silenced, my throat would clamp up tight as a signal to me that I had to say what I needed to say. And when I did, it finally would relax. The body talks. Slowly realizing that I wanted the second half of my life to be more introspective, I began to grasp the fact that I probably needed to move on from this relationship. It was not a decision to take lightly, because at the time, Joe was the main breadwinner in the family, and we'd been together for 20 years. Then, in the spring of 2003, I had an opportunity to house sit amid 35 acres of pristine woods and meadow. For 6 weeks, I could be away from the home context, and this made for clear reflection time. I entered a deeply contemplative discernment period, quietly making space for my soul and listening to my inner belongings. I talked frequently with my Sister Roseanne. She's well trained in the discernment process, and she guided me with big questions like, where are you going? And who's going with you? And with the support of the natural world, I gradually opened to my aliveness once again. When I came back home, I told Joe, indeed, I need to leave this marriage. He was surprised. He was distraught and rolling on the floor. And it was the hardest thing I ever did to watch. But I held firm to my convictions. Finally, after 45 minutes, he said, I'll do anything. I'll even explore my spiritual life. Well, we agreed to work on it for a time, and something did begin to open in him that summer. But by autumn, he said, this inner work is not feeling authentic to me. I don't think I want to do it anymore. His dark corners were just too deep. He had cracked the door a little bit, but then he turned away from his inner life and back to his mind candy preoccupations. A week later, I was considering my next move, and I had a profound experience on a long drive, and I hit a pronghorn antelope. I'm going to save the details on that one for another time as well. But the key takeaway on this one was to let go of this form and trust into that letting go. It was true for the pronghorn. It was true for my own life. And it was true for my mother, who, when I had given her permission, died a week later, putting my divorce proceedings on hold for that until late winter. Then one night in February, I was lying in bed, and I just bawled for 30 minutes solid, harder than I've ever cried in my entire life. Joe wanted to comfort me, but I did not want his touch. Finally, I got out of bed, and I sat on the toilet. I said, what was that? What came to mind was an image from that Earth literacy immersion. Miriam had described a metaphor for our 500-year development of this U.S. culture that we live in. Being like a developing chick in an egg, feeding off the nourishment inside the egg, but reaching the constraints of that egg, it can no longer find nourishment. And you realize that, and you have to have the courage to break out of that shell, or you will die. And it's time to seek new nourishment elsewhere. And so there I sat, wet and exhausted, like a chick who had just cracked through the shell of this marriage that would no longer hold me. After this, I continued to initiate the divorce process, and I moved out of the bedroom. About that same time, I dropped into Tattered Cover and saw this cover of the Parabola magazine on the topic of marriage, and quite literally opened right to this passage. Divorce does not mean that a marriage has been a failure. There are some marriages in which both partners have been true to their vows, yet a time may come when unlived parts of their personalities are striving to become conscious. It then becomes obvious that if they remain together, these two, who basically love each other, may fall into sterility and bitterness if they do not have the courage to suffer through parting. I read that passage from Helen Luke to Joe, and he finally understood why I needed to leave this marriage. A few weeks later, he moved out of the house. Free of his suppressive influences, I entered a healing time with my contemplative self reemerging as I chilled peacefully on the couch to nice, peaceful music. My self-esteem needed more proactive self-care, so I enrolled in a 12-week self-esteem group with a small Italian elder named Rosa Mazzoni. She was a gem of get your inner work done energy. Dealing with lots of fear and uncertainty, I told her, "It's hard. It's just hard." She replied, "It's not hard, dear. It's just unfamiliar." It was a wonderful reframe. Totally made me rethink it. Rosa puts you in touch with your intrinsic worth, the kind you're born with. She would joke. She'd said, "You're not your do, and you're not your do either." She helped me to identify disparaging messages that I'd received earlier in life. Truthfully, to name something is to gain distance from it. By the autumn of 2004, I made another investment in my life, and I went on a 13-day vision quest with Durango's own Animas Valley Institute and depth psychologist Bill Plotkin. Interestingly, the divorce became final the week of the vision quest. Literally crossing a threshold and making a covenant with your own life, a vision quest is intended to be both set and setting to court your inner beloved, to engage with your dreams, your shadows, numinous experiences, wounds, and longings. It included a 4-day fast, water only, and 3-day solo in wilderness, and there was ice on the bag in the morning, on the sleeping bag. Your inner and outer challenges bring you face to face with your own mortality, calling you to deeper purpose and fostering conscious life changes. Disruption of the status quo is sometimes what it takes to live the life you are meant to live. The following spring, I was injured in a car accident. Suddenly, I was thrown into body healing for the next 2 years. Eventually, my treatment included 15 rounds of very painful prolotherapy injections into my ligaments. I literally had to talk myself into going into that pain in order to heal. A friend recently described it as healing pain, an apt metaphor for one's inner work. Being willing to go into emotional pain is what's necessary for psychological healing. Again, AA wisdom: feel, deal, heal. I did those prolo treatments every other Friday, and I'd have all my meals prepared ahead of time on those weekends, and I would stay very still with my computer on my lap. Serendipity was also at play here because I was doing online dating. A man here in Durango contacted me. 14 months later, we decided to move in, and I began to pack my house. 2 weeks before the move, he expressed serious doubts. Once again, I held firm. Hey, I've already quit a job I love. I'm already packing. We're this far. Let's just give it a try. I had big fears, but I went ahead anyway, and that is my definition of courage. Indeed, that online relationship fizzled about 10 months later, but it gave me a free place to stay in Durango, and I fell in love with this town. This Buddhist wisdom has become, since then, my mantra. Move forward with intention, but don't be attached to the outcome. When I was moving out of his place, I was trying to decide if I should put down a deposit here on an apartment or go back to the Front Range. I still had a lot of fear and trepidation because I was only making $12 an hour at the time in retail, and I knew that would not sustain me. Meanwhile, my whole support network was still on the Front Range. So I asked the landlord, I said, can you give me just a few minutes by myself? And she said, yeah, I have to make a phone call anyway. So I dropped inside, and I asked Spirit, should I stay? Should I go? Once again, that guiding inner voice came clearly and said, stay. There's something waiting for you here. A week later, a woman at the Women's Resource Center, where I had walked into, handed me a job description for insurance, and it's the job that I still have today, and I still have clients who love me that I've had that entire time. 9 months later, I met my now husband, Jeff, who is like a soulmate to me, and we have an active partnership supporting our mutually enhancing life together. And this entire journey that brought me to here in Durango has also brought me to you, my UU friends and family, where I have found a spiritual home filled with love, light, and delicious belonging. I am grateful that all this is so. Blessed be, Ashe, and Namaste.